Hello, welcome to Getting Started with SharePoint Framework tutorial series. This is tutorial 4, HelloWorld Hosting Web Part from Office 365 CDN, and this is the December 2017 edition. Now, starting from Yeoman template version 1.4, the Office 365 CDN hosting is going to be the default hosting mechanism for any web part and extension what you're building in SharePoint Framework. So inside of the Yeoman template, we introduced additional capabilities which will automatically take care of the hosting for you as long as the Office 365 CDN has been enabled within your Office 365 tenant. So let's actually do that, and let's confirm that our hosting has been properly enabled within the tenant which we're using. So first of all, we need to connect to the tenant. So we're going to use connect SPO service, and the URL for this particular tenant which we're using is https sppkg admin, because we're connecting to the admin site collection or admin URL. And in here, we're able to then sign in using the right account, which has to be Microsoft.com, which has to be a tenant administrator in here to be able to modify these tenant settings. Now, in my machine, I'm using Windows 10, or in my case, I'm using the Windows 10 machine. So I'm going to use PowerShell for all of this operation, the SharePoint Online PowerShell, or the SharePoint Online Management Shell for the operations. If you are using an alternative operating systems, or if you're using a Mac or a Linux, you can take advantage of newly introduced Office 365 CLI, which is an open source community-driven initiative under the SharePoint PnP umbrella, which gives you the capability, for example, to configure and control the SPO tenant CDN settings using a command line based UI. So you don't have to then have a separate virtual machine where you are using a PowerShell, because the native SharePoint Online PowerShell is not supported with Mac or Linux machines. So, but there's a separate documentation available on this one also, and there's links within the written format of the tutorial where you can find the needed guidance to get started. In my case, like mentioned, I'm going to use a PowerShell to enable and or double check the settings of my SharePoint Online tenant CDN. And the easiest way to actually double check that's the settings is to use the get SPO tenant CDN enabled PowerShell, and then ask the setting for public CDN. In my case, the public CDN has been already enabled, but we'll obviously walk through how you can enable that as well. But this is the way you can easily confirm if the CDN, public CDN, has been already enabled in your environment or not. By default, when the public CDN is enabled, there will be a default set of origins which are listed in here, from where the content or the static content, again, not your actual content, static files are being served through the Office 365 CDN. And that's actually increasing the performance. So the loading times of the assets and loading times of the native JavaScript for your end user browsers. And key point here to understand is that this increases performance through the asset loading. It doesn't mean that anybody can access your content using anonymous endpoints. It's just exposing static assets like images and also JavaScript files through the public CDN URLs, which we'll look into more detailed as we move along within this tutorial. Now, how do we actually enable this if the tenant CDN wasn't enabled in your tenant? We run set SPO tenant CDN enabled, and we provide the CDN type public, because we want to enable the public CDN for hosting our SharePoint Framework solutions. And that's going to then do a double checking of the ask you to confirm this, and in our case we're going to say yes, we actually truly want to have Office 365 public CDN enabled. And that means that from these origins, the files which have these endpoints will be served through the CDN network, which will then increase the performance of your tenant. Now, if you are slightly concerned and you don't want to have all of the default public CDN locations to be exposed automatically, when you are enabling the public CDN, you can always do a switch no default origins, and that's going to then not enable the default settings. But to be able to take advantage of the automatic SharePoint framework solution hosting, you would then have to manually add this dynamic relative path or relative path to the origins. And then you don't, well, in that case, you wouldn't add those to the origins at all if you don't want to. Now, at this point, the CDN has been enabled, and the needed entry of client-side assets as a relative entry in the origins has been added in here. If you have enabled Office 365 CDN in the past, before the 1.4 release of the Yeoman templates, you would have to double check that this entry exists within your CDN origins. You can manually add it there by executing add SPO tenant CDN origin, and you basically give the origin URL there. So you write their client side assets, and that would then add that as an additional entry in the origins. In my case, because it already exists there, we don't need to do that. Now, we can always also, when we are enabling the client-side CDN first time, it actually takes a while to get all of the configurations enabled. It can take up to 15 minutes to take all of the configurations enabled between the default default origins. And you would see the configuration pending message right after this entry in here. So you need to wait until the configuration has been completed. It can take up to 15 minutes to complete, but it should be relatively fast. Now let's actually move into our Visual Studio Code side, and let's double check that our what is the situation of our solution, because we want to have our solution packaged or contain automatically, the solution package contain automatically the JavaScript files, so we don't have to manually host the CDN files anywhere, and we don't want to anymore host the local host or run the local host as the hosting location. So let me actually open up the Visual Studio Code, and we can configure and control how our solution is getting packaged by using the package solution JSON. And in here, a new attribute as part of the Yeoman template 1.4 is the include client-side assets. And by default, this entry is true. And this is now then controlling that when we are doing the production-ready bundling and packaging of our solution, let's actually include the JavaScript files inside of the sppkg file. If you don't want to do that, you can absolutely update this attribute to also to be false, and that would then mean that you would have to host the JavaScript, the CDN files, or the assets like JavaScript files and the manifest in your chosen CDN. And absolutely an option, but the easiest way to do this is enabling the Office 365 CDN in the tenant and then package stuff inside of the solution file. Now, how do we actually get all of this packaged? So in the tutorial tree, we already packaged our code, but we packaged the code in a way that the URL was pointing to the local host. And we want to actually package the code in a way that the URL is hosting dynamically to the CDN URL. Which could be changed, and we don't really, as a developer, we don't need to worry about what is the CDN URL or if the CDN is enabled or not, because even though the CDN would not be enabled, we can package the JavaScript files inside of the sppkg file, and the URL would then point to dynamically to the app catalog site collection. So technically, you do not need to have an Office 365 CDN enabled in your SharePoint Online tenant to be able to take advantage of the site asset packaging feature, which is part of 1.4 release and the newer versions of Yeoman templates. But how do we do that? So let's do some repackaging of our solution. First, we do a gulp bundle ship option with the ship option, which is getting ready and getting the JavaScript files optimized with the ship switch. And then we do gulp package solution. Let's actually clear that one. Gulp package solution and -- ship, and that's going to then package the solution by taking that attribute into account. So taking the fact into account where we want to include our JavaScript files inside of the sppkg file. So now, how do we confirm that this actually happened. So first of all, we can go to the inside of the SharePoint folder, extend to debug folder, and we can easily see in here the updated situation. Or we could just as well also actually reveal this one in the Explorer, go to the solution and the debug, and we can see the client assets folder actually getting created in here, and there's our JavaScript files which are getting created. And in the solution folder, there's our sppkg file. sppkg is actually a zip file which is just containing the content from these folders. So now that we know that the JavaScript files or the JavaScript files are inside of our sppkg file as well, we're able to take the sppkg and update that in our tenant. So let's actually do that. So let's go to our tenant, let's go to our app catalog. Let's go and drag and drop the updated solution package, which was packaged using that ship option equals true. And that's going to then prompt a message that, hey, there's already a file existing within the library. Would you like to replace that? And answer is yes in this case. And it's going to then prompt us with a second message because we changed the URL of the solution. And now the domain of hosting the client-side solution is something slightly different. It is actually SharePoint Online. And this is because the attribute or the URL is dynamically pointing to the SharePoint Online. So if the CDN is enabled, the URL is actually pointing to the Office 365 CDN. If the CDN isn't enabled in this tenant, it's going to point directly to the app catalog. And that's how we dynamically flip the URLs. But a key point and key advantage of this one is that now the developer does not have to know the URL and have to define the URL in the XMLs or in the JSON files. We are actually taking all of that taken care of for you. So let's actually deploy this one. And the updated solution has been deployed. And now let's actually double check. We don't have a local host running in the machines. And we want to actually test that the web part is working properly. So let's actually get back on the page, or you can create a new page as well. Let's actually do that. So you go to the site to create a new page in the site. Let's call this CDN hosted page. And let's add our HelloWorld web part on the page, and it's rendering properly. Let's save that one and actually double check where the loading and the assets are being loaded. In my case, I'm using Chrome. So if I do an F12, we can easily see where the information is getting loaded. And in the F12, we can actually see, let's actually do a refresh. In the F12, we can easily see the source is getting reflected. We can easily see that there's a public CDN SharePoint Online URL, which is the URL where the assets are getting served. And we can see that the JavaScript files are getting served from the public CDN SharePoint Online /sppnp sharepoint.com/sites/client-side assets URL. So if the Office 365 CDN would not be enabled, we would actually host those assets directly from this URL. Because the CDN is being enabled, we are prefixing that with an HTTPS public CDN SharePoint Online, which is then increasing the productivity, increasing the performance of loading and using these JavaScript files. But that's it for this particular functionality. So what we did here is that we took the existing existing client-side web port, and we repackaged that to be hosted dynamically using the Office 365 CDN. And this is by default, the default behavior starting from Yeoman templates 1.4. So you don't have to do anything extra around hosting the JavaScript files and JavaScript or assets related within your package. So everything is taken care of for you by default. You can still host these files in an alternative CDN if you choose to do so by modifying that attribute in the package JSON file. But that's it for this one. Thanks for watching.